November 12th, 1944. A German lieutenant, his uniform caked with mud and his face hollowed by exhaustion, crouched behind the ruins of what had once been a farmhouse in eastern France. He had been fighting the American advance for 6 weeks, retreating through villages, across rivers, into positions that were supposed to be defensible, but never were. His platoon had started with 42 men. He commanded 11 now, but what disturbed him more than the casualties, more than the relentless artillery, more than the tactical defeats, was something he had observed but could not explain. He had destroyed American vehicles. He had ambushed their convoys, blown their supply trucks with Panzerfaust rockets, watched them burn. And yet every morning more came. The Americans never seemed to run short of anything. Not ammunition, not food, and most impossibly not fuel. His own battalion had been stationary for 3 days, waiting for a fuel delivery that never arrived. German tanks sat motionless for lack of gasoline. But across the valley, he could hear the rumble of American engines, constant and unending. He had been taught at officer school that logistics won wars, that the side that ran out of supplies first would lose. So why were the Americans, fighting thousands of miles from home, drowning in fuel, while the Germans, defending their own territory, were paralyzed by its absence? The answer was out there, rolling toward him on the roads, but he couldn't see it. None of them could. Not yet. In the early planning stages of the invasion of Europe, American military logisticians confronted a problem that seemed at first glance to defy solution. A modern mechanized army consumed fuel at rates that would have seemed insane just 1 generation earlier. A single armored division required approximately 60,000 gallons of gasoline per day of active operations. The U.S. Army planned to land multiple divisions in France and drive them across Europe to Germany. The distances were staggering, the consumption rates were unprecedented, and every drop of fuel would have to be transported from tankers offshore, across beaches with no port facilities, through countryside with damaged roads and destroyed bridges, to forward units that were advancing, they hoped, at 30 or 40 miles per day. The logistical challenge wasn't just difficult, it appeared to be impossible. British planners, looking at the same numbers, quietly calculated that any advance beyond 100 miles from the Normandy beaches would inevitably stall as supply lines stretched beyond sustainability. This was the conventional wisdom, the accepted reality of mechanized warfare. But the Americans approached the problem differently. They didn't ask how to make existing supply systems work. They asked how to redesign the entire system from the ground up. The solution began with something so simple, so unglamorous, that its revolutionary nature was easy to miss. It was a metal container, rectangular, with a capacity of 5 gallons, and a spring-loaded spout that sealed automatically. The Germans called it a Wehrmachtskanister, a military canister. The British, with characteristic directness, called it a jerry-can, after their slang for Germans. The German design, introduced in 1937, was brilliant in its simplicity. It had 3 handles, so 1 soldier could carry 2 cans, or 2 soldiers could carry 1 heavy can between them. The shape allowed them to be stacked efficiently. The welded construction made them far more durable than the stamped steel cans other nations used. And critically, the spring-loaded spout meant they could be poured quickly without a separate funnel, without spilling, even in the chaos of combat. When British forces captured some of these canisters in North Africa in 1940, they immediately recognized their superiority. They sent samples back to England, and in 1942, American engineers studied the design and began mass production. By D-Day in June 1944, American factories were producing these containers at a rate of over 1 million per month. This wasn't glamorous. This wasn't advanced technology. This was just a well-designed fuel container. But it was about to change the nature of warfare in Europe. The German lieutenant behind the ruined farmhouse had noticed the containers, of course. His men had found dozens of them, abandoned by retreating American units or left behind at supply dumps. They used them themselves, grateful for their durability. But what he didn't understand, what none of the German commanders understood, was the scale. It wasn't just that the Americans had better fuel cans. It was that they had built their entire logistics system around fuel distribution flexibility. In the German army, fuel moved from rear depots to forward units in bulk tankers, when those tankers were available, when the roads were clear, when air superiority permitted movement. It was a rigid system, efficient under ideal conditions but fragile under stress. The American system was completely different. Yes, they used tankers to move fuel from ports to forward depots. But from there, fuel moved in those 5-gallon cans, loaded onto every truck, every jeep, every vehicle, moving toward the front. A supply convoy carrying ammunition would also carry hundreds of fuel cans. A medical unit moving forward would have fuel cans strapped to every available surface. The system was distributed, redundant, and nearly impossible to disrupt. You could destroy a tanker truck and create a fuel shortage in the German system. But destroying one American supply truck meant losing perhaps 50 gallons of fuel out of a supply network moving millions of gallons per day. The impact was negligible, unmeasurable. It was like trying to drain a river by removing one bucket of water, but the containers were just the foundation. The real revolution was in the trucks themselves. Before the war, the U.S. Army had used dozens of different truck models from different manufacturers, each with different parts, different maintenance requirements, different fuel consumption rates. Logistics was a nightmare of incompatibility. In 1940, the Army standardized around a single design, the GMC CCKW, quickly known to everyone as the Deuce and a Half because it could carry 2.5 tons. American factories produced over 560,000 of these trucks during the war. They were simple, rugged, and repairable with basic tools. More importantly, they were identical. Parts were interchangeable. Every mechanic knew how to fix them, and they could run on low-grade fuel that would choke more sophisticated engines. The Germans, by contrast, entered the war with hundreds of different truck types, many of them civilian vehicles pressed into military service. Maintaining this fleet required thousands of different spare parts. Finding the right part for the right truck was often impossible in combat conditions. German trucks broke down at rates that would have been considered catastrophic by American standards. American trucks broke down too, but they were fixed quickly, usually within hours, with parts that were available everywhere. The result was that American mobility was sustainable, while German mobility was slowly deteriorating. And mobility, in a war of rapid movement, was everything. The German lieutenant watching the valley had seen evidence of this, though he didn't have the framework to understand it. He had observed American columns stop, repair vehicles on the side of the road, and continue moving, all within the time it would take his own maintenance units just to assess the problem. He had seen abandoned American trucks stripped for parts, surrounded by other American trucks that were operational. The Americans seemed to waste vehicles the way his own army hoarded them. But it wasn't waste. It was abundance, and abundance enabled a kind of operational tempo that German units simply couldn't match. His own experience was typical of German forces across the Western Front. Days spent waiting for fuel, for ammunition, for replacement parts that never came. And during those days of waiting, the Americans kept moving, kept attacking, kept the pressure constant and unrelenting. He had been trained to think of warfare as a series of battles, with pauses in between for rest and resupply. But the Americans didn't pause. They didn't need to. Their supply system was designed for continuous operations, and that changed everything. Behind the American logistics miracle was a network that stretched back across the Atlantic Ocean to the industrial heartland of the United States. American oil production in 1944 exceeded 4 million barrels per day, more than the rest of the world combined. That oil was refined into various fuels, loaded onto tankers, and shipped across submarine-infested waters to ports in Britain and, after D-Day, directly to France. The scale was almost incomprehensible. In the 6 months following the Normandy invasion, American logistics units moved over 1 billion gallons of fuel to support operations in Europe. To put that in perspective, that's enough fuel to fill a typical backyard swimming pool in every town and city in France. The Germans, meanwhile, were running out. Their synthetic fuel plants, built to compensate for lack of oil fields, were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Romanian oil supply was cut off by Soviet advances. By late 1944, the fuel shortage in the German military was critical. Tanks were immobilized. Luftwaffe planes sat on runways because there was no fuel to fly them. Entire divisions were ordered to hold positions because there wasn't enough fuel to maneuver. The strategic situation had inverted completely from the early war years, when German mobility had been their decisive advantage. There was also a philosophy behind the American logistics system that differed fundamentally from the German approach. German military culture valued efficiency, precision, and careful planning. Supply calculations were exact. Units received precisely what they needed, no more, no less. Waste was unacceptable. This worked beautifully when plans went as expected. But when plans fell apart, as they always do in combat, the rigid system couldn't adapt. The American system, by contrast, was deliberately over-designed. Units were supplied with more fuel than they needed, more ammunition than they would probably use, more food than they could eat. There was redundancy built into every level. If one supply route was cut, 3 others were available. If one depot was destroyed, 5 others could compensate. To German eyes, this looked like chaos and inefficiency. But it was actually resilience. The Americans had designed a system that assumed things would go wrong and built in the capacity to keep functioning anyway. It was expensive, it was wasteful by traditional standards, but it was also nearly unstoppable. And in a total war where production capacity mattered more than efficiency, the American approach was devastatingly effective. The German lieutenant would never see the full picture. He couldn't. From his position in that ruined farmhouse, he could only observe the symptoms, the endless American convoys, the tanks that never seemed to stop moving, the constant rumble of engines that kept him awake at night. What he couldn't see were the hundreds of Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, each carrying thousands of tons of fuel. He couldn't see the massive supply depots in Normandy, acres of stacked fuel cans glinting in the sun. He couldn't see the elaborate pipeline system American engineers were building across France, eventually stretching hundreds of miles, pumping millions of gallons directly from the coast to forward areas. He couldn't see the planning rooms where logistics officers tracked fuel consumption down to the gallon and adjusted supply routes in real time. All he could see was the effect, and the effect was terrifying in its implications. His own army was starving for fuel, while the enemy, fighting thousands of miles from their homeland, was drowning in it. This violated everything he understood about warfare. And slowly, through that autumn of 1944, he began to understand what German commanders were quietly acknowledging in their reports. They weren't losing to better soldiers or better tactics. They were losing to better supply chains. They were losing to an enemy that had mastered the unglamorous art of logistics and had turned it into the decisive weapon of the war. By December 1944, the German fuel shortage was so critical that it influenced strategic decision-making at the highest levels. When Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive, the attack that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the operational plan, depended on captured American fuel. German tanks were to break through Allied lines, reach American supply depots, refuel from captured stocks, and continue the advance. It was a desperate gamble, a plan that assumed American supply abundance could be turned into a German advantage. The offensive initially succeeded in creating a bulge in the Allied lines, but the German units never captured the fuel depots in sufficient quantity. American engineers, recognizing the danger, destroyed their own supply dumps rather than let them fall into enemy hands. German tanks advanced until they ran out of fuel. then stopped, irreversibly stuck, perfect targets for Allied aircraft once the weather cleared. The entire offensive collapsed, not because of tactical defeats, but because the fuel ran out. German soldiers, some of the best trained and most experienced troops remaining to Germany, abandoned tanks and vehicles and walked back to German lines, defeated not by American soldiers, but by empty gas tanks. The Americans, meanwhile, supplied their forces through the Ardennes winter, maintaining operations, bringing up reinforcements, sustaining the pressure. The contrast could not have been more stark or more symbolically complete. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces drove into Germany itself, the fuel situation became even more lopsided. German military vehicles were being towed by horses because there was no fuel to drive them. Luftwaffe fighters were lined up on airfields, fully armed, fully operational, completely useless because there were only a few hours of flying fuel available for the entire Air Force. The Germans had the technology, the weapons, the trained personnel. What they lacked was the fuel to use any of it. The Americans, fighting hundreds of miles from their supply bases, continued to operate at full tempo. Their tanks moved, their planes flew, their trucks delivered supplies. The logistics system that had seemed impossibly ambitious in the planning stages of 1943 had become, by 1945, a machine of such power and efficiency that it rendered German resistance increasingly futile. This wasn't heroic, this wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. The German troops realized, far too late, that they had been defeated not in battle, but in the supply depots. Not by tactics, but by industrial organization, not by the courage of American soldiers, but by the unglamorous genius of American logistics planners who had solved the problem of keeping an army fueled across a continent. The war in Europe was won on many fronts, but one of the most important victories happened in warehouses. On loading docks, in the cabs of trucks, in the simple, revolutionary design of a 5-gallon fuel container that kept the armies moving when they should have ground to a halt. That was the lesson the Germans learned too late, and it was a lesson written not in fire and blood, but in the quiet. Constant rumble of engines that never stopped, of convoys that always came, of a supply system that turned American industrial might into the decisive weapon of the war.